Support for Carolina Business Review is provided by Grant Thornton. Operating in more than 100 countries, our tax, audit, and advisory professionals specialize in helping companies unlock their growth potential. Blue Cross Blue Shield of South Carolina. Please visit us at southcarolinablues.com. And Sunoco, a global manufacturer of consumer and industrial packaging products and provider of packaging services with more than 300 operations in 35 countries.
At first glance, our guest appears to be only one of 26 or so female CEOs on the Fortune 500 list, but to describe her in just that way is one-dimensional and does not really do her or the C-suite at this nation's largest publicly owned utility justice. Welcome again, and thank you for watching this Executive Profile special edition of Carolina Business Review. Our guest has probably been riding herd on one of Duke Energy's most critical times of growth and change in its 116-year history, certainly through things like the Duke Progress merger, before that and going on now, Duke Coal Ash, Duke Synergy acquisition, the challenges around the Atlantic Coast Pipeline project, and most recently the completed acquisition of Piedmont Natural Gas, et cetera, et cetera. In just a moment, Duke Energy Chair, President, and Chief Executive Officer, Lynn Good.
Major funding also by Novant Health, bringing you world-class technology, clinicians, and care when and where you need it. The Duke Endowment, a private foundation enriching communities in the Carolinas through higher education, healthcare, rural churches, and children's services. And by Blue Cross and Blue Shield of North Carolina. Who's responsible for rising healthcare costs? Join us and many others in a candid discussion at letstalkcost.com. On this edition of Carolina Business Review, an executive profile featuring Lynn Good, Chairman, President, and CEO of Duke Energy.
Hello, welcome to our program. Happy weekend. Madam Chair, welcome. Good to have you back.
Thank you so much, Chris. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. And by the way, congratulations. Specifically, you just came off of an earnings call. Third quarter earnings was good news. You surprised, I hate to use this term, but you just surprised the street and investors with better earnings than expected. Seems like you're smiling a little bit easier these days. And Lynn, also, is this a I don't want to say it this way. Is this a one-time thing, or do you expect that this is going to be a different trend now for Duke Energy going forward with these kind of surprises on the upside?
Well, a couple of things I would note, Chris. We had an extraordinary quarter at Duke, which is what we reported this morning, and a lot of things came together. We had good operational performance on the part of our assets, but we also had extraordinarily warm weather. And the third quarter for a utility is the biggest quarter, and so we had an opportunity to match demand for power with good operations, and that showed up this quarter in our results. But going to the longer term, which is really where your question is directed, is we've gone through a portfolio transition where we have exited businesses that are not as good of a fit with Duke, and we've moved into ones that we believe provide better long-term, stable, growing earnings for our investors. So this transition, for example, closing the Piedmont merger is a part of that. So what we represent to investors is a great opportunity to invest across energy infrastructure and deliver a stable and growing dividend, which we believe will be terrific for investors in the future.
When you do look at your portfolio, let's talk about it in detail without getting too much in the minutia, because I wouldn't want you to have to really go through that and really talk in larger platitudes, Madam Chair. But this idea of specifically Piedmont Natural Gas seemed like it was a good acquisition. Certainly was for Piedmont shareholders. Certainly seems to be a good fit for what your power generation is now. How do you make sure, as you're strategically thinking within the company with your senior leadership team and on the board and trying to look around a corner on the cost of energy like the cost of natural gas, how do you make sure that as you put so much investment into buying Piedmont or having a pipeline company Putting in the ground a big investment in this, how do you make sure that if there's a spike in that energy that you're not caught flat-footed with this huge investment out there?
It's a good question, Chris, because one of the hardest things in my job is that it's a very capital-intensive industry, and we're trying to invest not only for a good decision in 2017, but in 2020, and 2025, and 2030, because we have a long cycle business, and we'll be serving this region for many, many decades. So how we got comfortable with Piedmont is every direction we look, we see natural gas as part of the future. We're retiring coal plants. We're building renewable energy, and renewables have an intermittent profile. They don't work 24 hours a day. Gas is a natural complement to that. And then you look at nuclear. We're a big nuclear producer. We want to run those assets as long as we possibly can. Can we add more? Maybe challenging. Natural gas becomes an answer there as well. So as we look at what's developing around the energy landscape, we see increasing interest in renewables, and we think natural gas is a great complement to that.
Do you think nuclear is going to end up sunsetting at some point, and you won't really be able to go down that road because of the cost of not acquiring but building ground up?
I hope not, because as I look at the nuclear assets that we operate at Duke and the nuclear assets that are powering the United States, 20% of the energy comes from nuclear. 60% of the carbon-free energy in the U.S. comes from nuclear. Our objective should be to keep those assets running as long as we can, and then really challenge, can we bring new nuclear into the picture? Because it represents a resource that runs 95% of the time and produces no carbon. So if you and I were going to decide how are we going to power this country in a carbon-free way for 2050 and 2075, I bet we'd be talking a lot about nuclear.
Yeah. When you look at your customers, residential, commercial, industrial customers, where do you see the biggest engine for growth for you and for the utility industry in general?
Growth is a challenge for our industry, Chris, because of all of the great things that all of us are doing to save energy. So energy efficiency is a part of what we believe is important for communities and certainly important for our customers. Where the growth is showing up for us is new customers. So particularly in the Southeast, in the Carolinas, and in Florida, we are adding new customers at a rate of 1.5% a year. So that provides natural growth in terms of new customers. And then our industrial growth is really based on what's going on in the U.S. economy. We've had great growth in construction-related industries, automotive, more challenged in things like metals and chemicals. Anything exposed to overseas markets has been challenged in the near term. But if the U.S. economy moves, we should have good opportunities to grow industrial load.
Is it a zero-sum game? In other words, will you pick up, as you just said, Lynn, you will pick up business that moves to your service area, but moves down from Con Ed or National Grid or somewhere else? Is that how it works?
Well, I think migration of residents could be part of that.
Yeah.
So, if you have retirees coming to Florida and the Carolinas, that might be a zero-sum game. But my hope is the U.S. economy grows. And if the U.S. economy grows, then hopefully we're rising, manufacturing, production, goods and services in a way that not only benefits the electric business, but the economy at large.
So as Duke talks to the utility staff and the public utility commissions in the states that you do business with, that's where the rubber meets the road, I know, for a lot of you. But let's back up, let's zoom out a little bit. And the national idea of what a power grid should be and what a power grid is now and the reality of the policy of what the power grid is now, how far behind are we in policy versus where our technology has already taken us?
It's an interesting discussion, Chris, because the modernization of our industry is occurring in the way so many businesses are maturing. So it's not only modernization being driven by technology, but customer expectations. More information, more timely feedback from us on outages and bill alerts, maybe more choices on where the energy is coming from. And so we need to advance our investment in order to meet those customer expectations. And that's occurring regardless of policy. Our job is to deliver a great service to the customers that we serve in the way they want to be served. I think when you get into policy space, then you're talking about how is electricity generated. Of course, there's a lot of interest in incentives around renewables, but natural gas, as we talked about, is also important. And so we'll be continuing to modernize, not only to take advantage of technology, to keep our eye on where policy's going, but also to meet customer expectations.
So, but how do you do this? Not but how do you do it, but how do you do it as a, these are my words, this is not your word, but how do you do it as a constrained utility? You know, everything you do has to be vetted by a utility commission somewhere, somehow. You got to be careful about rates. You got to be careful about investment. You got to be careful about return, for crying out loud. So how do you become assertive and flexible and nimble, not just because of your size, but because of those who look over your shoulder in a regulatory manner?
I think those business constraints, Chris, that you talk about, I need to deliver value to customers, I need to deliver value to investors, and I have to keep my eye on the constituents, whether they're public policy, legislators, regulators. I think that's what business is today. And from my perspective, having a clear vision about where you're trying to go, understanding what your customers are expecting, and then sitting down, frankly, and having open discussion about what you're trying to accomplish and what those other stakeholders have an interest in your business, that's the only way you're going to get to solutions. And so, you know, at Duke, we try to be involved and at the table having discussions about where North Carolina wants to go. Where does South Carolina want to go? What are we seeing in terms of customer feedback and how do we meet those needs? And that's part of the input that has to be included in your decision making, or you won't be successful.
So what do you feel held back on? What do you feel like, gosh, you know, if we could get a pass, or we could get a little bit, not loosened regulation, because that sounds too laissez-faire, but what do you feel like you could really grow into if the policy were just a little bit different?
Chris, I think policy is a good place to have that conversation, because in the U.S. we don't have a national energy policy.
Do we need one?
If we could accomplish a national energy policy with a clear vision for the future, I think that would be incredibly beneficial to my business, because it's exactly what you and I are talking about. I'm trying to decide how to put capital to work and what to invest in for 2020 and 2025, yet I have no idea where the regulations and rules are going to be. You know, we talk about regulations, whether they're out of EPA, federal level, state level. They're often not coordinated. They're on top of one another. You may invest in a regulation and find that that regulation obsoletes all of the investment you just made because it's going a different direction. And so in a long cycle business like ours that's very capital intensive, where regulations can have a big impact on your decision making, it would be terrific to have a clear vision of the future on where we're trying to go. Carbon policy would be an example of that. We have Clean Power Plan. It's in the courts right now. It's only through 2030. And what comes next?
So let's talk about where the power comes from. Coal clearly is still I'm not going to call it a challenge, because people demand inexpensive energy, and coal is an inexpensive way to do it. Coal ash is a separate issue. I'd love to be able to get to that. But as you look at where you're going to pull your base load from, does coal have a diminishing future? Is that your hope? Is that the hope of your industry? You
know, Chris, coal has a diminishing future. And the reason for that is there is no way to build a new coal plant today without technology called carbon capture and some form of sequestration, and that technology is not viable today at the scale that you would need for the bulk power system.
So the cost to do business in that is just prohibitive?
Yes, you can't build new coal. So what you're talking about is over what time period will we continue to keep existing coal plants in the mix? And that has to do with how much capital investment is going to be necessary for further regulation. What's the price of carbon as we go forward? And so I do believe that coal will be a decreasing part of our mix as we go forward. We were probably 60% coal back in the 2005, 2006.
So not so long ago.
Now we're closer to 30% coal, and that percentage will continue to decline. So for base load generation, that concept of running 24/7, really the only short-term option that we have is natural gas. That's a base load fuel. Gas plant can run 85 to 95% of the time. And then nuclear over the long term could represent a new base load fuel, but as you know, expensive and takes a long time to build.
Well, and before we leave the coal idea, so I don't want to get too abstract here, Lynn, but as I think about coal and you going from 60% down to 30% of part of the portfolio over the last 10 or 12 years, does coal start to become more expensive the older the plant gets and the less that you can rely on as you said, we can't build a new coal plant. It would be cost prohibitive and it wouldn't work the way we want it to work within the portfolio. So are we approaching a tipping point where we're going to have to make a decision about our environmental sensitivity and our economic viability, or are we already there?
Those decisions are already there, Chris, because we every day look at capital investment in our generation fleet and have to make a decision. If I invest $100 million, how much longer am I going to be running that plant? And if the answer is unclear and the capital becomes bigger and bigger, it becomes too uncertain to make that investment. So then you start looking at alternatives. You look at natural gas, you look at renewables, you look at other things. So we're at that point right now. The coal retirements that we have already put into place were driven by rules to comply with mercury regulations. It didn't make sense to make those investments because of the uncertainty around the life of those plants.
Yeah, is there something about coal? Well, let's talk about coal ash for just a second, Lynn. And you've been very forthright and very forthcoming about this. And why does that continue to make a headline? Do you, in your mind, is it just because Duke is a big target? And I'm not being sympathetic to Duke, but why do you think coal ash, as much as it's been vetted now, why is it continuing to be a big headline?
You know, Chris, I'm not sure I have an answer to that. I do believe that over the 2 years, with lots of discussion around ash, in certain constituents, it's become an emotional issue. I think there's concern about safety and whether or not the ash can be stored safely. And so we have vigorously worked to talk about what we are doing to store ash safely, the progress we've made, the closure techniques that are underway, because we believe it represents a byproduct that's been stored for a number of decades. We're going to have to store it as we go forward, and to do so in a way that's safe is our commitment to the communities that we serve.
Is Duke Duke, well, let me say it this way, I don't want to put words in your mouth either, but Duke doesn't seem to be the only utility that has the challenge of coal ash.
So if we talk about coal ash, it's a byproduct from burning coal for 50 or 60 years. And Duke is not the only utility that's burned coal. So there are over 700 ash basins in the U.S., Chris. It is not a North Carolina and South Carolina issue, it's a U.S. issue. And as a result of that, the Environmental Protection Agency has put forward federal rules on how to safely store ash. And those federal rules are impacting all the states in the U.S., as they are Duke. In addition, we have a North Carolina law that we're complying with. So our commitment is to store it safely, and that's what we will do as we move forward.
Is the scrutiny on the coal ash ponds that are outside of your service area and your purview, has that increased to the same degree as it has within the Carolinas for Duke?
I think North Carolina has been ground zero on ash. And you know, it's a part of a discussion in other states, but I think it's fair to say it's been stronger here, Chris.
Let's talk about renewables in the renewable portfolio. This is a term that gets used a lot within your industry. Will that portfolio ever be substantial enough to carry a serious base load consistently?
I think renewables will continue to increase. So you think about the renewable standard here in the Carolinas, we'll be at 12.5% in the early 2020s. But I think the thing we need to recognize is that renewables today, based on the technology that's available, need to be a part of a portfolio. And it's for the obvious, point that the sun only shines between maybe noon and 5. And so what are you going to do to supply electricity in the morning and in the nighttime, and for the period in the middle of the day that perhaps an industrial needs more consistent power? If the cloud goes by, he's still running his manufacturing line. Right. And so here in the Carolinas, we actually have a peak load demand where more electricity is sold at any time in the wintertime. So February 20th, and the peak occurs between 7 and 7:15 in the morning.
And this is statistical?
This is statistical. So the last 2 years in the Carolina, our peak demand has been in the winter. And so, and it's, heating and cooling, or heating load, right? Right. Electric and gas, but electric load in the winter. And so the peak occurs between 7 and 7:15 in the morning. So it's dark in the Carolinas between 7 and 7:15. To meet that requirement, I need a portfolio of resources outside of solar. And so that's when I talk about portfolio. Renewables are going to be greater and greater. They're important. They'll continue to grow within our portfolio. But today we need to complement them with other resources so that we can provide power 24/7 in a reliable way that our customers count on.
So if the battery industry really came out with something just earth-shattering, would that change the calculus of that renewable portfolio?
I think batteries represent a very important technology that we are spending a lot of time studying. We have probably 20% of the utility scale batteries installed on the Duke system, trying to learn about them, how they work, how they complement other resources. So I do think battery technology will be important. But one of the things to think about, Chris, is in the month of January, as an example, our solar resources only met their full capacity for 3 days out of the month. So we're not talking about moving power between hours. We might be talking about moving power from months. I need sun that was shining in October to meet a need in January. So there are some complexities around a simple solution of batteries that, again, technology will develop and we'll work on that over time, but also complement those renewables with other resources.
Atlantic Coast Pipeline Project, fairly largely heralded back in 2015. It was a joint venture, of course, Duke, Piedmont Natural Gas, Dominion Resources to be the biggest three. You acquired Piedmont Natural Gas, but still have a minority position, and Dominion really is riding that and in charge of that. When you watch this, and if you get all of the approvals, does this become a lightning rod for what has gone on now in the Dakotas around the Dakota Access Pipeline? Are you watching that closely, or do you say, yeah, that's important, we want to be respectful, we don't think we'll have that problem on the East Coast? What are your thoughts?
I think pipeline construction is difficult. Chris, really any infrastructure is difficult. We could talk about transmission in the same way. Building long-haul infrastructure is difficult. I think there's a distinction between Atlantic Coast Pipeline and Dakota being an oil pipeline, Atlantic Coast being a natural gas pipeline, with the demand strongly needed in the Southeast for power generation and serving customers. We've enjoyed great support from the counties in North Carolina and from the state, also from Virginia. And I believe it represents great infrastructure and backbone to continue to expand economic development in the eastern part of the state. And so I think it represents a terrific opportunity for us. And we'll keep moving forward with our stakeholder process to explain the benefits. And as I said, we've enjoyed really strong support. So
when you meet the opposition on that, respectful or not, and they bring up the idea of environmental sensitivity and stewardship, how do you talk about that and not end up with a pipeline that's zigging and zagging and costs twice as much because you're trying to satisfy all special interest groups around the environment or anything that might come up?
Well, I think environmental impact is important. And part of the approval process and the review process and the routing process, Chris, is intended to bring out those key considerations around environmental impact. And we have executed a couple of reroutes for Atlantic Coast Pipeline already, being sensitive to a national forest area, being sensitive to some migration patterns involving some wildlife. And I think that's a process that has to occur. You're sitting down at the table with stakeholders talking about environmental impact and trying to come to agreement on what will have the least impact as we go forward. And that's the involvement we've had so far.
The Affordable Care Act. Here's one for you. We got a minute and a half left, and you got to get all this right. Not that you don't. So, Lynn, Affordable Care Act, third year in operation. It's become a bit of a pariah based on the cost, based on the fact that some major insurers have pulled out of the state exchanges. But more importantly than that, the cost for an employer, and certainly an employer for Duke, has to be a concern. So how do you plan around the unplannable?
So we provide health care for our employees, Chris, from our plans, not from the being a part of the Affordable Care Act. And benefit costs have been an important part and a cost of doing business for some time. And health care, of course, is an important benefit for our employees and something we want to provide for their peace of mind and for their families. So we've had a keen focus on wellness at Duke. We've had a keen focus on working with employees that have chronic illnesses, on how we can ensure they're getting preventative care and also the medication that they need to be successful. And so it's really a year-by-year exercise to make sure that we're doing all that we can to provide the benefits in a cost-effective way to our
Would you
employees.
expect to see any meaningful change in that, even though you're not a huge user of it as a percentage that maybe another business would? Would you expect that to be a meaningful dialogue after the election in about 10 seconds?
I certainly think so. I think healthcare will be on the agenda, as will other things.
Yeah, okay, nicely said. Thank you for actually wrapping it up in 10 seconds, because sometimes we can't. Thank you for being on the program. Again, congratulations, good earnings. You look like you're on a good arc here.
Thank you, Chris. Pleasure to be here.
Yeah, good to see you. Thank you, Sam, ma'am. Thank you for watching our program. If you have any comments or questions, please don't hesitate. Don't be shy. I know you won't be. CarolinaBusinessReview.org. Until next week, I'm Chris William. Good night.
Major funding for Carolina Business Review was provided by the Duke Endowment, a private foundation enriching communities in the Carolinas through higher education, healthcare, rural churches, and children's services. Blue Cross and Blue Shield of North Carolina. Who's responsible for rising healthcare costs? Join us and many others in a candid discussion at letstalkcost.com. Grant Thornton. Operating in more than 100 countries, our tax, audit, and advisory professionals specialize in helping companies unlock their growth potential. Novant Health. Bringing you world-class technology, clinicians, and care when and where you need it. Sunoco, a global manufacturer of consumer and industrial packaging products and provider of packaging services with more than 300 operations in 35 countries. Blue Cross Blue Shield of South Carolina. Please visit us at southcarolinablues.com. And by viewers like you. Thank you. Promotional consideration provided by Business North Carolina Magazine. For more information, visit carolinabusinessreview.org.